Hey everyone, welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're cracking open the actual rulebook that shapes how millions of us live, work, and interact every single day. We're diving deep into Chapter 2 of the Indian Constitution at Work, which is all about rights in the Indian Constitution. I absolutely love getting into foundational documents like this because, they aren't just dry, abstract legal texts. They're literally the active blueprints of our entire society. So grab a notebook, get comfortable, and let's explore the theory and the practice behind our constitutional rights.
Here's a quick look at exactly what we'll be covering today. First, the importance of rights. Second, fundamental rights explained. Third, the right to equality. Fourth, directive principles explored. And fifth, applying your constitutional rights.
All right, let's jump right into Part 1, the importance of rights. To really get why this matters, let's rewind a bit to the year 1982. The government hired contractors for some massive, totally unprecedented construction work ahead of the Asian Games. To build all those required flyovers and stadiums, the contractors brought in a huge number of very poor construction workers from all over the country. But here was the stark reality on the ground. These workers were kept in incredibly poor, grueling working conditions, and they were paid substantially less than the minimum wages that were legally decided by the government.
Well, the team of social scientists saw these dismal conditions and decided they had to take action, so they petitioned the Supreme Court. And they posed a really profound legal question to the court, one I want you to think about right now. Does employing a person to work for less than the minimum prescribed wage amount to forced labor? They argued that it absolutely did. Actually, scratch that. It wasn't just a simple wage dispute. It was a fundamental question of human dignity. It was constitutional rights being tested in real time.
So, with those stakes in mind, let's move on to Section 2, Fundamental Rights Explained.
You see, fundamental rights aren't just some vague philosophical idea floating around. They are explicitly locked into Part 3 of the Constitution. And that word fundamental is key here. It literally means these protections are so absolutely critical that they set hard, non-negotiable limits on government power. The Constitution deliberately creates these boundaries to ensure a democratic system works, where every single person, regardless of their status, enjoys these specific rights without interference.
But, rights aren't exactly a universal, one-size-fits-all deal. They evolve based on a nation's specific history and the unique challenges it faces. Take the South African Bill of Rights, for example. Their constitution explicitly guarantees socioeconomic protections, things like the right to healthcare, food, water, and social security, not to mention children's rights and the right to basic and higher education. It really shows how constitutions are living documents, specifically tailored to protect what a society deems most critical to its core survival.
And that brings us perfectly to Section 3, the right to equality.
Now, the right to equality isn't about ensuring everyone is completely identical. It's much more about balance. It's about fairness. It guarantees equal access and protections under the law completely regardless of a person's background. Honestly, it forms the absolute bedrock of a functioning democratic society.
Let's break down what this actually looks like in practice. The right to equality includes equality before the law and equal protection of laws. It explicitly prohibits discrimination on the grounds of religion, race, caste, sex, or place of birth. Practically speaking, this means equal access to public spaces, shops, hotels, wells, roads, the whole shebang. Furthermore, it emphatically mandates the absolute abolition of untouchability. The ultimate goal here is to secure both equality of status and equality of opportunity for all citizens.
But this brings us to a fascinating and, frankly, a very difficult philosophical hurdle. In a society that is already built on historical social inequalities, what does equal opportunity actually mean? Think about it like a race. If everyone starts from a radically different line on the track, is simply firing the starting gun fairly enough to guarantee equal opportunity? Well, the makers of the Constitution anticipated this exact dilemma. Article 16(4) of the Constitution explicitly clarifies that policies like reservations, which are special schemes and measures in jobs and admissions designed to improve the conditions of children, women, and socially and educationally backward classes, these do not violate the principle of equality. In fact, these measures are implemented precisely to achieve genuine, substantive equal opportunity in a society that is actively grappling with deeply rooted historical inequalities.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit to Section 4, Directive Principles Explored.
So here's an absolutely crucial distinction you need to understand. Fundamental rights are judiciariable, meaning if your right is violated, you can literally take the government to court to seek a legal remedy. Directive principles, however, are non-judiciariable. You cannot sue the government to force them to implement these, but they serve as a massive moral compass. They were incorporated into the Constitution to bring about equality and well-being, essentially acting as a direct policy blueprint for future governments to follow.
But just because they are non-justiciable doesn't mean they are ignored. Quite the opposite, for sure. Over the years, governments have given effect to many directive principles. They've aggressively passed zamindari abolition bills, they've nationalized banks, enacted numerous vital factory laws, and fixed minimum wages. This shows us that while you can't sue to enforce them, directive principles possess immense moral weight. They actively shape major national legislation and policies.
And speaking of enforcement and monitoring, it's definitely worth mentioning that alongside the courts, institutions like the National Human Rights Commission, or the NHRC, play a vital role. The NHRC can conduct independent inquiries into human rights issues and can actually recommend to the courts to initiate proceedings based on their findings. So there is an entire ecosystem designed to protect these principles.
All right, time for Section 5, applying your constitutional rights. Let's do a little pop quiz.
Imagine a national airline where overweight male cabin crew are routinely promoted, but their women colleagues who gain weight are actually penalized. Which fundamental right is at play here? Well, if you guess the right to equality, you hit the nail on the head. This clearly violates the prohibition of discrimination on grounds of sex because it treats male and female employees entirely differently for the exact same physical criteria.
Okay, how about this one? A director makes a documentary film that actively criticizes government policies. What right protects them? That's the right to freedom of speech and expression. It brilliantly demonstrates how citizens can use their rights to safely voice dissent and hold their own government accountable through art and media.
Last one. Imagine people displaced by the massive construction of a big dam, taking out a rally to demand proper rehabilitation. Here, they are actively exercising their right to assemble peacefully, and they are advocating for their fundamental right to life and livelihood, basically demanding that the government fulfill its basic obligations to its displaced citizens.
Let's leave off today with a pretty provocative thought. During the initial drafting of the Constitution, some members, like Somnath Lahiri, argued that way too many limits and exceptions were placed on our fundamental rights. So where do you stand on this? Should rights be absolute, no exceptions, or must there always be caveats for a state to effectively function and maintain order? It's the ultimate balancing act between government power and individual liberty, isn't it? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and until next time, keep learning and keep questioning.